Today, a hope of many years' standing is in large part fulfilled. The civilization of the past 100 years, with its startling industrial changes, has tended more and more to make life insecure. Young people have come to wonder what would be their lot when they came to old age. The man with a job has wondered how long the job would last. This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health. We can never insure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life, but we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-stricken old age. It seems to me that if the Senate and the House of Representatives in this long and arduous session had done nothing more than pass this security bill, Social Security Act, the session would be regarded.
Yes, we are back here on WLTH 1370 AM. That's 92.7 in the FM dial. It is 7:37 in the PM here on August the 15th, 2025. The future is here. The future is now. Yes, it is. The future not looking so bright if you are dependent on Social Security, it looks like. So long they've tried to erode it. But I think it's important for us to look back on this 90th anniversary. Yesterday was the 90th anniversary of the Social Security Act. You heard FDR in the intro there to talk about why the Social Security Act was so important and why Social Security is so important. As I said, it was enacted on August 14th, 1935, exactly 90 years ago. The act was drafted during President Franklin D. Roosevelt's first term by the President's Committee on Economic Security. It's important to really give props to the driving force behind the Social Security Act, a woman named Frances Perkins. She was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. The first woman ever to hold that position, to hold any position in the U.S. cabinet. And she, to this day, Frances Perkins is the longest tenured labor secretary in history. She was in that position from 1933 to 1945. Yet another reason why FDR was boss. The act was an attempt to limit what were seen as dangers in the modern American life, including old age, poverty, unemployment, and the burdens of widows and fatherless children. What a lot of people forget is that we used to have horrific poverty for old people in this society. You would get old, you didn't have a pension, you didn't have Social Security, you would just be out in the streets. That's what the Great Depression looked like for folks. And I think it's very important for us to understand that so many of us in this time in history have never seen what America used to be like 90 years ago when people lived through the Great Depression. There are very few people who are old enough to have lived through that. You'd probably have to at least be 95, 96 years old to remember what 1930, well, I guess you'd have to be in your you'd at least have to be in your 90s to know what 1930s America was like. but from what I've read and seen of documentaries, it was horrific. And this is why this act came about. Roosevelt actually became the first president to advocate federal assistance for the elderly in this country. So we just used to let old people die. The act provided benefits to retirees and the unemployed and a lump sum benefit at death. Payments to current retirees are financed by a payroll tax on current workers' wages, half directly as a payroll tax and half paid by the employer. Self-employed people are responsible for the entire payroll tax. The act also gave money to states to provide assistance to aged individuals for unemployment insurance, aid to families with dependent children, maternal and child welfare, public health services, and the blind. My God, man, we got mosquitoes in here. You have to forgive me. I'm not having a seizure in here, folks. I'm just dealing with these mosquitoes who keep flying around me. The father of Social Security is a man named Edwin Witt, who developed the 1934 proposal for a federally funded pension plan. Now Social Security is the most popular and almost universally agreed upon program in American history. The only people who have an issue with it generally are politicians and the people funding politicians. But it's important to understand that at the time, in 1934, 1935, Social Security was controversial. It was controversial. One point of opposition being that it would reduce the labor force. So they thought, if we have to keep pimping these old people out until they die. That was the stance of the government and some people in our government. And you might be able to guess what the opponents of Social Security called it at the time in 1934, 1935. I'll give you a few minutes to guess what it was. They called it socialism. They called it socialism. Just like they call every single thing else that every other first world nation has, that the United States does not have, they call it socialism. And then they wonder why tens of millions of Zoomers and millennials call themselves socialists. Because you were the type of people who were calling Social Security socialism. That's why that type of dishonest fear-mongering, what we call anything that might give American citizens a leg up and actually being able to survive socialism, ultimately backfires on the people using those dog whistles. Now, it's important to state that it was not perfect. It was not perfect. Most women were excluded from the benefits of unemployment insurance and old age pensions, as most women were not workers at that point, especially, well, white women. Let's just be real. Most white women were not workers, and, so they were not considered eligible for unemployment insurance and old age pensions. There were a lot of different jobs that were not covered by the act. That included workers in agricultural labor, domestic service, government employees, a lot of teachers, nurses, hospital employees, librarians, and social workers. The act also denied coverage to people who worked intermittently, people who had sort of unstable employment. Now, Why was that the case? These jobs were dominated by women and minorities, particularly black people. Women made up 90% of domestic labor, particularly black women and Hispanic women. 2/3 of all employed black women were in domestic service. And so it's important to say that in spite of the fact that Social Security is the most important and the greatest program that the United States ever created, it's been 90 years and it's never missed a payment to somebody it was supposed to send a payment to in 90 years, that when it was started, FDR had to make certain concessions, particularly to the Southern Democrats, who had their foot thoroughly on the necks of black people. And it's important to understand that that mentality still exists to this day. The reason we don't have universal health care in this country, the reason that we don't have universal education and other countries do, other countries with higher living standards, better quality of life, better education in the United States do, this is why. Same reason that all those jobs were not eligible for Social Security. Black people might get it too. They will look you in the eyes and tell you that we can't afford this while sending $300 billion to Ukraine, wasting $6 trillion in Iraq. While America, and I'm going to talk about this probably next week, about how America spends more on health insurance per person and a lot more in general than all the other countries of the world, because we don't have a universal health care system. Because we don't have a universal health care system, we spend more than we should. But they have no problem getting that being the case, as long as the perception isn't that all these shiftless, lazy black people, and I guess some immigrants, don't get it. That was the mentality then. That's the mentality now. There's always money for the military-industrial complex. We're about to start spending over $1 trillion per year, more than the next 9 countries combined. We just gave tens of millions of dollars to Jewish students who felt offended. They got reparations for being offended by anti-Gaza genocide protests at Columbia University. But they can't find reparations for legacy black Americans. And that's another reason why I like doing these types of stories, because it shows you the mentality of Americans doesn't change. The mentality of America doesn't change. Time goes on, but the same strain of anti-working class bias, anti-black bias still goes on. It just manifests itself in different ways. Exclusions exempted nearly half of the working population, nearly 2/3 of all African Americans in the labor force, 70 to 80% in some areas of the South, and just over half of all women employed were not covered by Social Security. These are the concessions that had to be made in order to get Social Security for some people at the time. The Southern Democrats. It's always the South. It's always the Southern plantation owners, basically, with the plantation mentality. That's who it is now. That's who's talking about getting rid of Social Security now, today. Usually the same types of people. At the time, the NAACP protested the Social Security Act, describing it as a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through. And that's important to understand, that is true at the time. The Social Security law was unpopular with many groups, especially farmers who resented the additional taxes and feared that they would never be made good. They lobbied hard for exclusion. But this is why the Social Security Act is so important and why it's important to open that door. It gradually moved towards universal coverage. By 1950, debates moved away from which occupational groups should be included to how to provide more adequate coverage. So you see in 1935, when Roosevelt first got into office and gave us Social Security as a nation, they were arguing, should it be here at all? By 1950, it was how do we cover more people? That's what 12 years of New Deal policies did. It broke the backs of a lot of the worst anti-class, anti-working class, anti-black bias to the point where they had to open it up. They had to. Now, in modern times, with Social Security covering virtually everybody, Social Security is the most successful government program in the history of the world. For 90 years, it has paid out every single benefit owed to every eligible American on time and without delay. In 2023, Social Security lifted 28 million Americans out of poverty. 28 million Americans were lifted out of poverty by Social Security, including more than 20 million seniors. Before 1935, half of the nation's senior citizen population was living in poverty. Today, that is less than 10%. We went from 50% to less than 10% of seniors living in poverty in this country, thanks to Social Security. This is what they're trying to take away from us. Nearly 40% of seniors rely on Social Security for a majority of their income, and nearly 1 in 7 seniors rely on it more than 90% of their income. And to make matters worse, nearly half of Americans 65 to 74 have zero retirement savings. Meanwhile, the average Social Security benefit is less than $2,000 a month. And so all you hear is that, oh, we can't afford this, we can't afford this. That's complete nonsense. We had Bernie Sanders brought forth a way to keep Social Security funded for 75 years. It was called the Social Security Expansion Act. All it would have done was require the wealthiest American households to pay their fair share of taxes. CEOs, now the way things work, a CEO making $20 million a year pays the same amount of money into Social Security as somebody who makes $176,000 a year. How's that fair? The legislation would have lifted the cap and subject all of the income above $250,000 to the Social Security payroll tax. 91% of households would not have seen their taxes go up by 1 penny. By 1 penny. It would have expanded Social Security benefits across the board for current and new beneficiaries. Social Security benefits for current and existing recipients would have been increased by $2,400 a year. It would have included cost of living adjustments, and it would have much more accurately measured the spending patterns of seniors by adopting the Consumer Price Index for the elderly. But of course, they can't do that. They can't do that. Their corporate overlords won't let them do that. Not only that doesn't just apply to the Republicans, that applies to the Democrats too. Now you know why in 2016 and 2020 they made sure that Bernie Sanders could not be president. This is why when somebody like Zoran Mamdani or some other left-wing candidate comes out and says, we want to do what Franklin Roosevelt did, we want to do what LBJ did and improve people's lives, the mainstream of the corporate Democratic Party say, no, no. How you think you're going to help people? We got donors to protect. Obama's already called Zoran Mamdani to tell him to calm down. Hey man, calm down. What are you doing? Just like he called up the NBA players when they were going to go on strike in 2020 for police brutality and to stop the racism that was going on against black people. Obama called them up too. Told Kyrie Irving and them, don't march, don't protest, don't just go back to work. Just go back to work. Just do what you got to do. That's the purpose of the modern corporate Democratic Party. They are not LBJ's party. They are not FDR's party. They're the Clintons' party and Obama's party of Wall Street establishment corporatists. And that's why they no longer deserve my vote. And that's why they don't get it. And then, until they start following up the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt with things like the Social Security Act, they won't get my vote again. And you should seriously reconsider whether you want to vote for a party that's not going to fight to maintain things like Social Security that people fought and died to get as well. The Republicans are who they are. They're open and honest about being who they are. They are the same people who called the Social Security Act socialism. That's who they are. Back in the 1930s. And they're doing it still now. But at least they're upfront with it. They don't pretend to be friends. At a certain point, we're going to have to show both of these parties what power we have by using our voice, using our votes to get rid of, to throw all the bums out, regardless of their political parties.